I'm Teresa Carraggio, and this is Third Paradigm. My title today is Corbett, Unz, and World War II, The Unnecessary War. In one of those serendipities that I've learned to pay attention to, I was reading an article from 2019 in the Unz Review called American Pravda, Understanding World War II. It was on a 2008 book by Pat Buchanan called Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War. As I was reading it last April, Keith Knight from Don't Tread on Anyone and James Corbett came out with 10 lessons from Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War, taken from that same 15-year-old book. Because of the aggressive censorship of C.J. Hopkins by Germany for the ghost image of a swastika that he's embedded into a mask that muzzled not just free speech, but all speech for 2 years, and is threatening again on the horizon for October. This reminded me that I had done a draft of this article, which was at that time too long for email on Substack. So I'll be mostly reading this. So if you want to just skip to the text on Substack, where it'll have all the links and all the quotes, that is perfectly easy to do. I did an episode on CJ a year ago that I'll link to in the Substack, in which I disagreed with him and Margaret Anna Alice that we were repeating the same pattern as Nazi Germany. In fact, I think that's what Matthias Desmet is also saying in The Psychology of Totalitarianism, but from the opposite side. CJ looks at totalitarian control creating compliance, and Desmet looks at mass formation making totalitarianism possible. I had wondered at that time if we knew the truth about World War II and whether the good guys had really won over the bad guys. As we've been told, was Hitler a rogue actor or an actor in the literal sense of playing out a script that was written and produced by others? Who might those others have been? I explored this later in the episode Did Fascists Win World War II, which I'll also link at the end. So I think it's a good time to learn the history of World War II, so that if we are to be jailed or fined for it, like CJ, it will be for actually showing what they're trying to hide. Let's dive in. Let's start with Keith Knight and James Corbett, which I'll put into bullet points. I recommend the 40-minute video as fast-paced and jam-packed. So this starts with Keith and an opening quote. "The state is the health of war. This is the result of having unique access to a central bank, the recognized right to collect money involuntarily through taxation, the ability to conscript men into fighting in wars against their will, a monopoly on compulsory education, and a legal double standard which allows mass murder to go unpunished under the guise of foreign policy." They then alternate lessons learned, starting with James. Number 1. The success of Churchill's starvation blockade. What was the Treaty of Versailles and why did Germans sign it? Buchanan writes, Germany faced invasion and death by starvation if she refused. The blockade was maintained for a year after World War I, not allowing Germany to buy food or any neutral country to sell to them. He writes, the birth rate has changed places with the death rate. So see also Corbett's prolonging the agony and sanctions or war by other means. Number 2. Germany did not declare war in either World War I or World War II. In World War I, Belgium called on an 1839 treaty with England that it would intervene if armed forces entered Belgium. In World War II, it was Neville Chamberlain who sent the ultimatum that unless Germany withdrew its troops from Poland, England would declare war. James adds number 3. Britain gave assurances far ahead of either war that if any action occurred causing Poland to decide it was in their vital interest to use its own national army, Britain would join them. They also promised to intervene for Holland, Switzerland, Romania, Greece, and Turkey. Number 4. Churchill wrote his ambassador, "British policy for 400 years has been to oppose the strongest power in Europe by weaving together a combination of other countries strong enough to face the bully. This competition between empires justified actions against Spain and France, so he said he had no anti-German bias." Number 5. Buchanan lists Allied atrocities ordered by Churchill, including the incineration of Dresden. He writes, "If Britain initiated terror bombing, America perfected it." Boasted Curtis LeMay of his famous raid on Tokyo, "We scorched and boiled and baked to death more people that night of March 9th to 10th than went up in vapor in Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. We fought for moral ends, but not with moral means." Number 6. World War I ended with Britain at 1 million square miles, and Lenin, Stalin, Hitler, Mussolini, far more dangerous despots than Franz Joseph or the Kaiser. Poland ended up in the hands of Stalin. Churchill said to Stalin, "We started this war for Poland. Can they at least have free elections?" Stalin answered, "Free elections? Like in British-occupied Egypt?" And then he lists the numbers that were killed in each war for each country. 7. Churchill was an enthusiastic eugenicist, going back to 1910 when he talks about the rapid rise of the feeble-minded and insane classes and how that constituted a race danger. Number 8. C.P. Snow quotes Lindemann on the Allied bombing campaign. "The bombing," he said, "must be directed to working-class German houses. Middle-class houses have too much space around them and are bound to waste bombs." With this strategy, he claimed, it would be possible to destroy 50% of the houses. So this precedes the Blitzkrieg by months, and they say it was as heroic a decision as Russia's policy of scorched earth. Number 9. Buchanan shows that America ended the war as the sole superpower because it stayed out until the very end, then scooped up the spoils of war as the decisive element. And number 10. Making the point that World War II was unnecessary, Buchanan points out multiple times when the U.S. could have gone to war and didn't, that turned out better for it both geopolitically and economically. And now on American Pravda by Ron Unz. Ron Unz begins his review of Buchanan's book with why he had published a very hostile review of it when it came out in Buchanan's own former journal, the American Conservative, after Unz had come to own it. In 2003, Buchanan had published Whose War?, blaming Jewish neocons for the U.S. invasion of Iraq. Although he was no longer associated with the journal in 2008, they wanted to distance themselves from attacks as anti-Semitic. But after the book and review came out, Unz read it for himself and found he had made the wrong decision. He writes, "The first part of his volume provided what I had always considered the standard view of the First World War. But although his narrative was what I expected, he provided a wealth of interesting details previously unknown to me. Among other things, he persuasively argued that the German war guilt was somewhat less than that of most of the other participants, also noting that despite the endless propaganda of Prussian militarism, Germany had not fought a major war in 43 years, an unbroken record of peace considerably better than that of most of its adversaries. Moreover, a secret military agreement between Britain and France had been a crucial factor in the unintended escalation, and even so, nearly half the British cabinet had come close to resigning in opposition to the declaration of war against Germany, a possibility that would have probably led to a short and limited conflict confined to the continent. I'd also seldom seen emphasized that Japan had been a crucial British ally, and that the Germans probably would have won the war if Japan had fought on the other side. However, the bulk of the book focused on the events leading up to the Second World War. Buchanan described the outrageous provisions of the Treaty of Versailles imposed upon a prostrate Germany, and the determination of all subsequent German leaders to redress it. But whereas his democratic Weimar predecessors had failed, Hitler had managed to succeed, largely through bluff, while also annexing German Austria and the German Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia, in both cases with the overwhelming support of their populations. Buchanan documented this controversial thesis by drawing heavily upon numerous statements by leading contemporary political figures, mostly British, as well as the conclusions of highly respected mainstream historians. Hitler's final demand that 95% German Danzig be returned to Germany just as its inhabitants desired was an absolutely reasonable one, and only a dreadful diplomatic blunder by the British had led the Poles to refuse the request, thereby provoking the war. The widespread later claim that Hitler sought to conquer the world was totally absurd, and the German leader had actually made every effort to avoid war with Britain or France. Indeed, he was generally quite friendly towards the Poles, and had been hoping to enlist Poland as a German ally against the menace of Stalin's Soviet Union. Ron Unz then talks about the major journalists and authors of the 1930s who were disappeared from history for writing about World War II. For instance, Harry Elmer Barnes is credited with having played a central role in revising the history of the First World War so as to remove the cartoonish picture of unspeakable German wickedness left behind as a legacy of the dishonest wartime propaganda produced by the opposing British and American governments. And his professional stature was demonstrated by his 35 or more books, many of them influential academic volumes. A few years ago, I happened to mention Barnes, Unz writes, to an eminent American academic scholar whose general focus in political science and foreign policy was quite similar, and yet the name meant nothing. By the end of the 1930s, Barnes had become a leading critic of America's proposed involvement in World War II and was permanently disappeared as a consequence. Over a dozen years after his disappearance from our national media, Barnes managed to publish Perpetual War for Perpetual Peace, a lengthy collection of essays by scholars and other experts discussing the circumstances surrounding America's entrance into World War II, and have it produced and distributed by a small printer in Idaho. His own contribution was a 30,000-word essay entitled Revisionism and the Historical Blackout, and discussed the tremendous obstacles faced by the dissident thinkers of that period. The book itself was dedicated to the memory of his friend, historian Charles A. Beard. Since the early years of the 20th century, Beard had ranked as an intellectual figure of the greatest stature and influence, co-founder of the New School in New York, and serving terms as president of both the American Historical Association and the American Political Science Association. As a leading supporter of the New Deal economic policies, he was overwhelmingly lauded for his views. Yet once he turned against Roosevelt's bellicose foreign policy, publishers shut their doors to him, and only his personal friendship with the head of the Yale University Press allowed his critical 1948 volume, President Roosevelt and the Coming of the War, 1941, to even appear in print. Beard's stellar reputation seems to have begun a rapid decline from that point forward. Indeed, Beard's once dominant economic interpretation of history might these days almost be dismissed as promoting dangerous conspiracy theories, and I suspect few non-historians have even heard of him. After I read that, it rang a bell, and so I had to go check my library, and I don't have that one, but I do have an economic interpretation of the Constitution of the United States by Charles A. Beard. So that sounds like another episode. An author of a different book was called Unconditional Hatred by Captain Russell Grenville of the British Royal Navy. Unz writes about him. One of the intriguing aspects of his discussion is that much of the anti-German propaganda he seeks to debunk would today be considered so absurd and ridiculous it has almost been entirely forgotten. While much of the extremely hostile picture we currently have of Hitler's Germany receives almost no mention whatsoever, possibly because it had not yet been established, or was then still considered too outlandish for anyone to take seriously. Among other matters, he reports with considerable disapproval that leading British newspapers had carried headlined articles about the horrific tortures that were being inflicted on German prisoners at war crime trials in order to coerce all sorts of dubious confessions out of them. Some of Grenfell's casual claims do raise doubts about various aspects of our conventional picture of German occupation policies. He notes numerous stories in the British press of former French slave laborers who later organized friendly post-war reunions with their erstwhile German employers. He also states that in 1940, those same British papers had reported the absolutely exemplary behavior of German soldiers towards French civilians, though after terroristic attacks by communist underground forces provoked reprisals, relations often grew much worse. Most importantly, he points out that the huge Allied strategic bombing campaign against French cities and industry had killed huge numbers of civilians, probably far more than had ever died at German hands, and thereby provoked a great deal of hatred as an inevitable consequence. At Normandy, he and other British officers had been warned to remain very cautious among French civilians they encountered for fear they might be subject to deadly attacks. Although Grenfell's content and tone strike me as exceptionally even-handed and objective, others surely viewed his text in a very different light. The Devon Adair jacket flap notes that no British publisher was willing to accept the manuscript, and when the book appeared, no major American reviewer recognized its existence. Even more ominously, Grenfell is described as having been hard at work on a sequel when he died suddenly in 1954 of unknown causes, and his lengthy obituary in the London Times gives his age as 62. Then Unz talks about an eminent French historian named Cicely Huddleston, who wrote France, the Tragic Years, 1939 to 1947, giving a surprising account. Unz writes, as Huddleston describes things, the French army collapsed in May of 1940, and the government desperately recalled Pétain, then in his mid-80s, and the country's greatest war hero, from his posting as the ambassador to Spain. Soon he was asked by the French president to form a new government and arrange an armistice with the victorious Germans, and this proposal received near unanimous support from France's General Assembly and Senate, including the backing of virtually all the leftist parliamentarians. Pétain achieved this result, and another near-unanimous vote of the French Parliament then authorized him to negotiate a full peace treaty with Germany, which certainly placed his political actions on the strongest possible legal basis. At that point, almost everyone in Europe believed that the war was essentially over, with Britain soon to make peace. While Pétain's fully legitimate French government was negotiating with Germany, a small number of diehards, including Colonel Charles de Gaulle, deserted from the army and fled abroad, declaring that they intended to continue the war indefinitely, but they initially attracted minimal support or attention. Although Pétain's new French government guaranteed that its powerful navy would never be used against the British, Churchill took no chances and quickly launched an attack on the fleet of his erstwhile ally, whose ships were already disarmed and helplessly moored in port, sinking most of them and killing up to 2,000 Frenchmen in the process. This incident was not entirely dissimilar to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor the following year, and rankled the French for many years to come. Huddleston then spends much of the book discussing the complex French politics of the next few years, as the war unexpectedly continued, with Russia and America eventually joining the Allied cause, greatly raising the odds against a German victory. However, the most remarkable claims in Huddleston's book come towards the end, as he describes what eventually became known as the liberation of France during 1944 to 45, when the retreating German forces abandoned the country and pulled back to their own borders. Among other things, he suggests that the number of Frenchmen claiming resistance credentials grew as much as 100-fold once the Germans had left and there was no longer any risk in adopting that position. And at that point, enormous bloodshed soon began, by far the worst wave of extrajudicial killings in all of French history. Most historians agree that around 20,000 lives were lost in the notorious Reign of Terror during the French Revolution, and perhaps 18,000 died during the Paris Commune of 1870 to 71 and its brutal suppression. But according to Huddleston, the American leaders estimated there were at least 80,000 summary executions in just the first few months after liberation, while the socialist deputy who served as Interior Minister in March 1945 and would have been in the best position to know, informed de Gaulle's representatives that 105,000 killings had taken place just from August 1944 to March 1945, a figure that was widely quoted in public circles at the time. Since a large fraction of the entire French population had spent years behaving in ways that now suddenly might be considered collaborationist, enormous number of people were vulnerable, even at risk of death, and they sometimes sought to save their own lives by denouncing their acquaintances or neighbors. Underground communists had long been a major element of the resistance, and many of them eagerly retaliated against their hated class enemies, while numerous individuals took the opportunity to settle private scores. Unz concludes this section by saying, John T. Flynn, Harry Elmer Barnes, Charles Beard, William Henry Chamberlain, Russell Grenfell, Cicely Huddleston, and numerous other scholars and journalists of the highest caliber and reputation all told a rather consistent story of the Second World War, but one at total variance with that of today's established narrative. And they did so at the cost of destroying their careers. A decade or two later, renowned historian A.J.P. Taylor reaffirmed this same basic narrative and was purged from Oxford as a consequence. I find it very difficult to explain the behavior of all these individuals unless they were presenting a truthful account. And then he also writes about a young historian named David L. Hagen wrote his 1948 dissertation on World War II and expanded it into a 700-page book called The Forced War, arguing that powerful British interest had provoked Hitler into it. Even though only published in German, it ruined his life and career. Unz writes, in 1984, an English version of his major work was finally about to be released when the facilities of its small revisionist publisher in the Los Angeles area were firebombed and totally destroyed by Jewish militants, thus obliterating the plates and all existing stock. Living in total obscurity, Hagen himself died of a heart attack in 1988, age 65. And then Unz has made the PDF available, but doesn't vouch for the veracity of all its claims. So no alternative compendium of World War II would be complete without a link to Murray Rothbard's Revisionism for Our Time. So I have that in the Substack, and I also include a link to Catherine Watts on the alleged neutrality of Switzerland and one on the Internet Archive copy of Tower of Babel. And Emmanuel Pastrique has published the 1918 speech by Eugene Debs against World War I in 3 parts called To Whom Do the Wall Street Junkers Marry Their Daughters After They Have Wrung Millions from Your Sweat, Your Agony, and Your Life's Blood? And I'll have links to all 3 of those. And of course, Eugene Debs ran for president from prison. Each of these really deserves its own episode, along with work that's been compiled by Matthew Crawford and by Matt Arrett and Cynthia Chung. So this is just dipping a toe into a very deep and muddy pool to be continued at your own peril of ending the myth forever of the good war. And to follow up, here is C.J. Hopkins and the New Normal Reich, and also, did fascists win World War II? Thank you for watching.